in the early 1900s to late 1800s, there was almost no macular degeneration, no chronic disease. What specifically changed? You outlined four main food groups that have changed. And if you could go into each one of those in a little bit of detail and why we had no macular degeneration, we basically had no cancer, cardiovascular disease, and now it's exploded.
Right. So, the first thing I thought, Kerry, it was that if my hypothesis that macular degeneration is driven by processed, nutrient deficient, toxic food consumption. I don't use that term toxic lightly. I can explain that in detail. But if these foods are also driving macular degeneration, then one thing had to be true. Macular degeneration once had to be rare because we didn't have processed foods 150 years ago, essentially, and I can give you the details on that. I'll come back to that. So what I did was I figured that this had all been researched, that, the history of macular degeneration. And in fact, only one ophthalmologist had ever done any significant research on that. I think the supposition has been that macular degeneration prevalence, macular degeneration has always existed. The prevalence has always been high. And that this is a disease of aging and, genetics. And all of those assumptions have proven erroneous. And again, I don't say that lightly either, but so I went back and began to investigate this, and macular degeneration was discoverable in 1851 because of the genius of Hermann von Helmholtz, who designed the ophthalmoscope. And so the use of the ophthalmoscope was widespread within a decade of his publishing his book. So in the 1850s and 60s, the ophthalmoscope was in use all around the world. But and I probably won't go into all those details, but it was 23 years before the first cases of macular degeneration were described by Jonathan Hutchinson in London in 1874. And 1895, for example, Otto Haupt reviewed 50,000 ophthalmic medical records, patients with ophthalmic medical records, and determined that macular degeneration was as rare as traumatic maculopathy and myopic maculopathy. And you and I both know those are extremely rare disorders. The typical textbooks from 1851 to 1930 either did not mention macular degeneration or would give it essentially one sentence. And yet we know that by 1975, the Framingham study showed that macular degeneration affected 8.8% of Americans over age 52 and 27.9% of patients over the age of 75, I believe it was. So almost a third of people over the age of 75 by 1990. So that was 4.5 million people. But if you looked back to 1920, or let me just say this, between 1851 and 1930, there was no more than about 50 cases of macular degeneration in all the world's literature. And so we know that 80-year period, the disease was just extraordinarily rare. And yet, today, 2020, there's 196 million people affected in the world. So here's what happened. All right, 4 processed foods: sugar, refined white wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. This is exactly what Weston Price essentially showed us in 1939 and 1945 was driving all of this westernized disease in populations all around the world as they transitioned into westernized food consumption. So sugar between 1822 and 1999 increased 17-fold. Sugar is a nutrient deficient processed food. All right. Second, vegetable oils. The first vegetable oil in the United States was cottonseed oil, and it was introduced right after the American Civil War in 1866. Essentially, most of the world, probably 99.8 or 9% of the world, had never consumed a polyunsaturated vegetable oil in their life. And certainly we had none in the United States and none in the UK. Anyway, so this was the beginning of vegetable oil consumption. 1880, we got refined white wheat flour because of roller mill technology, which could remove the bran and the germ from wheat and give us a refined white wheat flour. Well, refined white wheat flour is a nutrient deficient food. And today, wheat is 20% of the world's diet. In the United States, 85.3% of that is refined, meaning it's nutrient deficient. So it's kind of like sugar in that regard. We're not getting nutrients out of it. And then in 1911, Procter & Gamble introduced trans fats with their product Crisco. And so Crisco is basically partially hydrogenated and hydrogenated vegetable oil. So it also comes from vegetable oil. But if you put those four foods together, you have processed food. So when people say, when people, begin to vilify saturated fat, for example, which really started at about in 1961, and or fat in general, which was in the 60s and 70s, and or they point the finger at the U.S. dietary guidelines, which told us to go low fat in 1980. I'm going to go back here. If you go back and look at all of the history in a nutshell, what you see is that we had all the processed foods in place by 1911. Sugar, refined wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And what happened is that Big Food just took those foods and today took those four ingredients and makes 600,000 food items in the US out of those. And as of 2009, our own USDA reports that 63% of the American diet is made up of those four foods: sugar, refined wheat flour, vegetable oils, and trans fats. They know this, Carrie. They report it. I use their slide in almost every one of my talks to show our own USDA recognizes that this is a massive problem. And somebody there at the USDA knows that's what's driving all of this. They know it's connected to a lot of this chronic disease. So that in a nutshell is our problem.